Hello and welcome back to the Simplifiers podcast, where we take topics in business and in life and simplify them. My friends, today I feel like on this particular day, as it is the general election in the U.S., today, as in my U.S. friends go out and vote today, really, really important. This episode, I hope, will inspire you to get up and get out and vote today as well, because I have a very special guest on today. Her name is Renee Powers, and she is the host of Wild Cozy Truth, and she is going to help us understand and simplify what it means to be a feminist in 2018. Renee is a multi-passionate entrepreneur dedicated to amplifying women's stories. She's the host of the podcast Wild Cozy Truth, where she interviews women from all walks of life to tell their own truths, recognizing that we learn and heal from telling and listening to our truths. She is also the founder of the Feminist Book Club, a monthly subscription box that features a feminist book and self-care items from women-owned businesses from all over the world. So I'd like to welcome to the Simplifiers podcast today, Renee Powers. Hey, Renee.
Hi, thank you for that introduction.
I'm so glad you're here because I feel like, can I just be so bold? I feel like there's a major shift happening in the world. And I'm saying that as a Texas girl living in the UK, but also feeling it in all of my friends that are in the US and Canada. Something is changing right now. And I hope it's for the better. So why I brought you on today is I really want to talk about what it actually means to be a feminist in this day and age. So can we start by saying, tell us what feminism means to you. How would you define it?
So I also have to add to that introduction, I call myself a PhD dropout, meaning I did 6 years of a PhD program in communication studies and gender studies. Mm-hmm. So I was steeped in feminist theory and feminist literature for many, many years in the academic setting, and there's nothing simple about feminism
in any way, shape, or form. But
right. But I can share with you my approach to it and how I have seen it unfold and make change on an individual level. But mm-hmm. I also have to share that feminism is a global and community-driven movement. It's not just about the individual. Mm-hmm. So if I were to define it, the goals of feminism are the personal, political, social, and economic equality of all genders and all people. Mm-hmm. Feminism recognizes that gender is more than a binary. It's not just male and female. Gender is fluid. There are non-binary folks in this world who don't fit either. There are people who who choose to play with gender and show up masculine one day and feminine the next day. So feminism recognizes that gender is fluid. It is so inherent to our personalities and our lives. And all of us, regardless of how we present ourselves, are worthy and deserving of opportunity.
Yeah, and that's it. And I think, gosh, there's so many places we can go with this. Here, where I'd like to talk about first is the shift of roles in sort of where we are in 2018 versus where we were, say, in the 1950s. I mean, things have fundamentally changed in the household, in the workplace. I mean, the roles of women, the roles of men. Do you see that as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's been a huge shift. And so if we could break down the history of feminism, especially in the West, especially in the US, I mean, that's where I'm located, and that's where feminism, as we kind of culturally conceptualize it, has really gained traction. So the first wave of feminism was women's suffrage, was the right to vote in the US, women gaining the right to vote in 1920. The second wave is kind of what you're talking about, is that backlash post-World War II of women were actually in the workforce. You know, we see Rosie the Riveter. There was jobs for them. They were in industry, and the men came home from war, and then they were relegated back to the home. Mm. And so you saw this kind of sleepy housewife persona that was expected of feminine presenting women. And slowly but surely, we started to see a shift of women getting more involved in politics and getting very angry with their position in society. And from that, we saw the civil rights movement. We saw women's liberation of the 60s and 70s. And so that was all kind of this second wave. There aren't necessarily parameters around when waves end and begin.
Right.
But we saw this kind of mid-century, right? Mid-century. The third wave, some would argue we're still a part of it, but it's really the same feelings. Women are in the workforce, but they're not being heard. They're in the workforce, but they're not getting a seat at the table. They're choosing when they can have children, but there's still, people that want to take that right away from women. And so around the 1990s, we started to see this other shift of, okay, well, we got this far. What would be that final crack to the glass ceiling, right? We can see all the way up, but there's something still holding us back. And so some would argue that the third wave began in the 80s and 90s. We saw Murphy Brown on television. We saw Designing Women on television, kind of modeling this for us as well. And then I would also argue that there's now a fourth wave, and we're seeing this more digital activism. And it's so easy for us to get information that feminism becomes commonplace. It becomes something that people are talking about more because they have access to that information. It's not just people or women or activists in urban areas. Feminism is a topic of conversation in rural areas as well, from all genders, all ages, all political, all politics. So do I see a shift? Yeah, I can ride those waves and see, how we've gotten from there to here. I still believe, and many feminists believe, I would argue all feminists believe, there's a lot of room for growth.
Yeah. Well, and I think even in my own lifetime, so I'm 41 now, at the time of this recording, even in my own lifetime, the shift of the mother, of the business owner, of who sits at board tables, in boardrooms, has changed from the 70s to 80s onwards, and I don't know. I think all of it is very fascinating to me in that I think you're absolutely right. The distribution of information now is so much easier than it was, say, in the early 80s. I remember being a kid and when you had to do a research paper, you have to go to the Dewey Decimal System in the library. It's like those little card catalogs to find the things. That was our Google back then. Whereas right now, my children can Google anything and find pretty much, solid answers to major questions and tiny questions. So I think there's access to information that wasn't there before, that makes it quite powerful to make a movement happen. So what do you think are like the biggest issues still that we as women are facing? Like, what are the big ones, do you think, that come right out in your head?
Well, feminism is about the eradication of patriarchy. And I think that encompasses a lot. And we see it play out in an intersectional manner. And so let me break down a couple of those terms. So patriarchy is the social structure that's designed to put and keep men in charge, or the masculine in charge, right? So we see this in, the founding documents of the United States, where all men are created equal. Even that language, right, is patriarchal. All men are created equal. Men and man has been used for so long as a catch-all for people or humans, right? And so it's embedded in the very foundation of our country. It's embedded in our language. And I also have to emphasize that patriarchy hurts men too, right? Patriarchy also says that boys don't cry, or that real men do X, Y, and Z. Real men drink beer. Real men drive Harleys, right? Like, yes, okay, men can drive Harleys, men can drink beer, men can also cry, right? And so patriarchy isn't just keeping women down. It's for the full, it's tamping down the full expression of all genders.
Yeah. Yeah.
And privileging the traditional hegemonic masculine position of power. I mentioned the term intersectionality. Recognizing that our identities are intersectional is fundamental to current feminism. And this is a term that was coined by a Black feminist researcher in, I think, the 1990s. Her name's Kimberly Crenshaw. Mm-hmm. And she coined the term intersectionality, recognizing that identities have many facets. We're a multifaceted people. We are not just a woman. We are not just white. We are not just, English speaking. Mm-hmm. All of these identities are, I think she calls them a matrix of identities, actually. And they intersect and they play with one another, and they show up in certain ways in certain settings, right? So more so than just being myself, a white, mostly heterosexual woman in the U.S., there are, your ability status, whether or not you are disabled, your religion. I grew up Catholic, but that's, Christian is kind of the most powerful default in the Western world. Whether or not you own land, what your social economic status is. So all of these things come together to determine where we can move most freely within social structures. Mm-hmm. And so I would argue that the most pressing feminist issues of our time are breaking down those structures so our intersectional identities can be, really liberated. Mm-hmm. So those institutions and structures don't favor one identity over another or one facet of our identity over another, that we can show up fully intersectionally and participate as much as a, able-bodied English-speaking white male Christian landowner could.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I hear the hesitancy in your voice because I know this is such a hard subject to really talk about. And you know so much more than I think a lot of people do because you study this in school and you really are, living this in your everyday life as a feminist life coach. But even you still, it's hard to, talk about these things. Am I right? Because there is, because it is so deeply ingrained into how our society runs and operates. You relaying the point of all men are created equal. It's oh yeah, there's that thing that we say, and there's these things that are in our language that are so fundamental that we don't even think about because it's something that we've grown up with for years and years and years. But I think what I hear you say in all of this is, can we as a society get to a point where our gender isn't the thing that we're judged on first? Is that what you're saying? Really in the fundamental level, is it that, because I think humans tend to make snap judgments about people when they walk down the street, right? And I think if we peel back the onion in the very basic, simplest of ways, what we do as humans is we go, are you safe or not? Or, and that's what's happening when we make snap judgments about people. Are you safe? Yes, you're safe. Okay, carry on. Are you safe? Yes or no. And I think one of the biggest women's issues that are still out there is that we get judged upon because we're female, right out the gate. Are you smart enough to do this? Are you capable enough? And that's where I start to go, my gender does not have anything to do with that. I know what I'm capable of, and all of that. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah. In fact, I would push back on that.
Yeah.
I would say that my gender is exactly what you need to be seeing, right? So I don't want you to not see my gender. I want you to see my gender and then see that as an opportunity to include other voices. And I would argue that women of color especially are making this point even more salient, that they're showing up unapologetically as Black women, saying, I want you to see me as a Black woman, but also I need you to respect and honor that position in society and listen to me and incorporate, my feelings and my stories into whatever you're doing. So in the business realm, if we don't take into account people's genders and sexualities and races and abilities, then we're screwed. Yeah. That we're only designing a society for the default, which is, the white, masculine presenting male, heterosexual, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. The most privileged. And I'm not saying that guy is bad. Like, I'm married to that guy, that is not inherently bad. But I'm not asking for people not to see my gender. In fact, I'm asking for you to see my gender and see it as something good, something I can contribute.
Yeah, another voice in the conversation, right?
Yeah.
So what ways in your mind right now, 2018, can we, the listeners who are on this episode now, make a positive impact on women's issues? Like either big or small. What do you think is actually working right now?
Yeah. Showing up to the extent that you are able and the extent you have access to showing up. And I mean that physically in physical spaces, but also showing up with your dollars, supporting women businesses. I think I read something, and, this, I'm going to throw out a stat that's not fact checked, but it's something like if every woman spent $1 on women-owned businesses, there would be something like $20 million, in the pockets of women. Yeah. Right. And so economic status is huge. It's one of the biggest reasons why women can't leave relationships. And so it's one of the biggest things that patriarchy, right, uses to keep women down. So I think that showing up, using our dollars as our voices, if we have access to spend money that supports women in business, but also, I know a lot of the listeners here are business owners, using our own. I'm a business owner too, and I source my product from women-owned businesses because I know how important that is, right? Yeah. Supporting other women in business, however that makes sense for you. But also make mistakes, man. Like you're going to show up. It's going to get messy. But as long as you are willing to make mistakes, you're willing to say something messy, that's not necessarily been fact checked, or you might use privileged language or racist language or ableist language, but showing up anyways, and then the willingness to be corrected. And just if somebody says to you, hey, listen, Mary, I really would appreciate if you didn't necessarily use that word, and here's why. And if you were to say, oh, thank you so much for correcting me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's being bold to actually have the conversation in the first place. Yes. I think that's it, is that we also are in a day and age right now where I think everybody's really nervous. Like, somebody's going to shut me down because I've said the wrong thing. Or, there's another podcast, what's it called? Yo, is this racist? Have you heard that one?
That's so awesome.
Great. It's so funny and hilarious because, and they take topics where I'll put a link in the show notes for everybody to be able to listen. But they take topics where callers will go, yo, is this racist? If I do this, and they give advice. I mean, and I think that's again a telltale sign of what's going on in our current day society, of that, it is scary because we don't want to be like, oh God, you're so racist, or oh God, you're so sexist, or oh God, whatever, right? But then also being brave enough to ask the questions and to start the conversation helps that break down the fear. And that's it. That's all there is that's circling behind why people hold other people back, or why the patriarchy still exists, and why women make, three-quarters to the dollar of what men make, is because it's fear. And once you can dispel the fear, diffuse its power, start conversations, then it's like, oh, actually, it's not that bad. We don't have to be afraid of this thing anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. I would add to that it's really important to take care of yourself, especially in those scary moments, those acts of bravery, those bold statements. Do that when it feels safe, and then honor what you need in those moments too. I think Audre Lorde says something along the lines of self-care self-care isn't selfish, it's a radical political act. Taking care of oneself, putting oneself first is it's a non-negotiable. You have to take care of the self in order to show up and use your voice and be courageous. So yeah, be unabashed about it.
So what else can we do to make a positive impact, specifically on women's issues? So people that we said, don't forget to hire and work with other women-owned businesses. What else can we do?
Vote for women, especially today. And don't go in and just vote for the women's names. Like, do your research. There are several feminist and pro-feminist men on your ballot. I'm certain of it. But fundamentally, our government needs more women's voices.
Yeah, talking about reproductive issues, talking about healthcare, talking about education for our children. I mean,
on both sides of the aisle. So I would say look into your candidates, see whose views most align with yours. And if there are two that you're just like, I don't know, like, they both seem okay, vote for the woman. And I know that seems simple, and I know that seems gender essentialist, but the very fabric of this country needs to progress, needs to keep going. And the only way we can do that truly is representation, diverse representation in our government. So I would say, go out of your way to vote for and support with your dollars some of those marginalized voices. I live in Minneapolis, and I'm so excited to vote today for Ilhan Omar. She is the first elected Somali American official in the country. She was our state rep, and now she's running for Congress. So I'm hoping by the end of today that we will have a Somali American woman in our Congress. I think it's so exciting to see these kinds of voices show up and really get their hands dirty in Washington, D.C.
Well, and I think that's it. I mean, what we just started with in this conversation is talking about conversations we can have as the general public, one-to-one, or with our girlfriends, or in our workplace, or in our church, or wherever, right? But then it's also helping elect the right people in those conversations, in government, in places of power, so that they can start having those conversations as well. And that's really what it is. And I think we as voters sometimes think, I'm just one person. What can I do to really change anything? But as we've seen in the last election, every single vote counts. Regardless of where you stand on issues and matters, every single vote counts. So yeah, it's so critically important that you guys are doing the right thing today.
Yeah. Agreed.
So can we shift gears a little bit? And I say this in the most loving of ways with my male listeners that are listening right now, but please, for the heaven God, let's talk about mansplaining. Because I just, so first off, define mansplaining for us.
It's usually talking over or interrupting or explaining something that women most likely already know, but men's voices are more privileged, and men are just really bold, and they like to hear themselves speak a lot. And there are certain men who like to explain things that are simple or take ideas from women, and this happens everywhere.
Yeah.
Not just
not all men, let's be very clear.
And not all men. There are great men in the world.
But, when it happens, what do you do? Like,
my goodness.
Yeah. Can you give us some simple, practical tips so that we can handle this the next time we're in a meeting at work or we're at a function, a dinner party, and somebody's doing it? Like, what works for you?
I'm still figuring it out. And that's the thing. Like, I'm still making mistakes and showing up anyways. But diffusing is one of the best strategies, is just saying, hey, thank you for your insight. Stroke that ego. Mm-hmm. Everybody likes to be heard. I would appreciate a moment to share my position. Mm-hmm. And just not escalating at all, or not calling the person out, showing up with love and respect, and say respectfully, I would like the floor here, or can I say my part? I don't know, maybe don't ask for permission, just do it. But I could share with you a couple of examples of, it's really hard for women to do this themselves. And I think I would argue in those situations, in those spaces, what I would call on other men to do is to help those other women, help their voices be heard. I read a Facebook status. I don't know. It got shared in one of my academic circles. I think she was a theologian or theology professor, researcher, and she was working on a presentation at an airport after a conference, and this stranger came up to her and asked what she was working on, and she said, oh, I'm a theology researcher, and this is my research, and I'm working on a presentation. And he proceeded to talk to her about his position on, I don't know, religious issues. I'm not sure what he was talking about, but talked to her and talked at her for a solid 30 minutes or something. And her colleague stepped in and said, hey man, you just had one of the world's leading researchers on this or this issue, and you really missed out. You really missed out on, learning from her. And yeah, you got to catch your plane now. So I'm sorry, but I feel bad for you. You missed out on this opportunity. Mm-hmm. And, that advocacy right there, that little shift of somebody advocating on your behalf in a situation or environment where you couldn't necessarily do it for yourself, that is life altering. That is so respectful. And so I would argue that one of the best ways to diffuse mansplaining is having an ally, having a male ally step in for you. And I know that sounds like, oh, I don't need a man to, or that you do need a man to, fix it. But I think that patriarchy has to be fixed or dismantled by men.
Yeah. And
because I think racism needs to be dismantled by white folks.
Yeah. And I think that's a valid point. I mean, I can imagine if you are about to jump into a meeting and there's multiple people in the room and mansplaining has happened where one of your female colleagues has been shut down, anybody in the room, it doesn't matter if it's male or female, could just say, well, hey, thanks, John, for that opinion. I'm really curious to hear more from Sally on what she thinks about blah, blah, blah. Sally, and being brave enough to step up and say that, of just okay, thank you, John, for your opinion, kicking it over back there, Yeah. And I think that you're absolutely right that it isn't necessarily just the person who it's being targeted at as their responsibility to step up to it, but everybody else that's witnessing it as well.
Yeah. And just not being afraid to be an ally instead of a bystander.
Yes.
And that's a really active way to do it. It's just, like you said, shifting the conversation back to the person who was interrupted, and making sure all voices are being heard.
Yeah. And I think that, as we said earlier, I think this is just zooming into one thing that is such an annoyance in our everyday life right now. But when we zoom back out and we go look at our politics and world issues and women's issues and things that are happening in our city, town, US, wherever. I think it's critically important for us as the individual to also remember to find other feminists like me right here in my local community. So do you have any tips or ideas of how we can find other people like me locally or nationally?
Women's organizations are a great place to start. And I would say that there's, you're going to run into all politics at a just general women's organization, but you're also going to find your people. Some churches are a great way to find other feminists too, especially, really progressive Christian churches, Unitarian churches, Jewish synagogues often have like a women's board or a women's committee.
I dare say like meetup groups as well. Like you could probably go through Meetup and find other groups that are, and not, I want to also be clear. I don't think all feminists are like activists and like Birkenstocks and like, angry and all of that. I mean, I think we're just humans, right? We just want to progress humans to be at an equal level, So I think sometimes feminists, we get a bad rep.
There are so many stereotypes. Honestly, we could talk about feminist stereotypes till we're both like blue in the face. But you'd be surprised if you're one of those people that has a stereotype that feminists are like angry, butch, like you said, Birkenstock, bra burning, hairy lesbians. Like you're sadly mistaken. You would be surprised who you might be able to connect with. If you're looking for other feminist women that in your community, you might be surprised what that looks like for you.
And where do you also connect with people? Because I know you have the Feminist Book Club, so you're connecting people through every month through your books and the self-care packages you take out or you send out to your subscribers. Where else? Like, do you find online Facebook groups or like where do you find your people?
So the Twin Cities, Minneapolis is just like this bastion of weird, fantastic people. And I'm so lucky to live here. I just moved here a year ago, and I'm really lucky that it's really easy for me to go out and find like feminist events and like, our Pride Festival is incredible. It's so fun and open for everybody. It's amazing. So personally, I love going to, feminist festivals. There's a great one in Duluth that I was just at, and the Feminist Book Club had a booth at called Femin Fest. Women in business meetups. There's a lot in the entrepreneur community in the Twin Cities is also super supportive. So I do a lot in that circle and in that sphere, and there's most of the women in business in the Twin Cities, I would say, identify as feminist. So it's really easy. But, where do I find people? Just festivals and theater and meetups and connections. Since I have a podcast, some of my listeners say, hey, you need to meet this person. And they happen to be in Minneapolis. And so we'll grab coffee and they'll introduce me to somebody else. I can't tell you how many times this has happened. And I ended up hosting a monthly brunch, just getting all of these kind of one-off connections together. And so now we have this like really rad ladies brunch once a month on my grandmother's china, just to like, connect and find friends. So bringing people together, like go ahead and do that. People love being invited to things.
And I think didn't you have an episode recently on your podcast that was all about building meaningful relationships? Like that's really what it's all about these days, because we are so sucked into our social media and into having, these walls in between us that we have become isolated as people, no matter where you live in the world. Like we are more interconnected and we are more isolated than we ever have been before because of technology. But I think that the shift is also changing here as well, where we as humans are starting to realize the vapidness of that and how it feels very like shallow, and that coming back to center in real life conversations, connections, dinner parties, supper clubs, all the things, because that really helps us as a human, regardless of if we're extrovert or introvert, to get back to center. And then that's where human issues come up, and we have these open conversations and say, oh, well, actually, there's 10 of us here. And actually, we each have, 100 some odd friends. And that's where it starts spreading and, making true movement in your local neighborhood, your city, and in your country, right?
Yeah. And just being unabashed about it too. Like, hey, I'm looking for friends. Introduce me to people. And you'd be surprised who would step up to the plate. In that podcast episode you referenced, Jillian Richardson was the guest, and she's the creator of the Joy List in New York, which is a list of events where you can show up and leave with a friend. It's incredible. But we talked about being open-minded to connectors. Like, who is a connector in your community? It could be your neighbor. It could be your aunt. It could be your hairdresser. Like, you might be surprised who would step up to the plate if you said, I would really like some friends. I'm looking for, badass women who are willing to read a book with me. Like, I'd like to start a book club. Who would you suggest I invite? Just being open to that.
Yeah. Well, what is your hope then, or maybe vision, in your lifetime? Like, where do you hope the world will go in the next 40, 50, 60, 70 years when it comes to feminism?
I would love to see equal representation in positions of power. Yeah. Or just a diverse representation in positions of power. And this is in business and government, in, your local school board, in your local church. I think the more voices, the more diverse voices we have included, just the better we can be. I struggle with the word empowerment. I think that empowerment is just like cheering somebody on. When I was teaching, I used this visualization. I said that empowerment, say there's a fence, and that fence is, something you're trying to get over, something you're trying to overcome. Empowerment is standing next to somebody and saying, I believe you can figure out a way to get over this fence, and I'm going to celebrate it. I believe it. I will celebrate you when you get over there. You can do it, right? Justice is saying, hey, I see you can't get over this fence. I'm going to bring a step stool to help you because, you're not quite as tall to get over this fence as some of the other people. So here you go. This is justice. This is me providing the tools for you to get over the fence. Liberation, I think, is the key. Liberation says, this fence shouldn't be here. Let's dismantle it together. We'll find the right tools together, and let's just take this fence out completely. And I think that is my goal, ultimately, is getting rid of the fence altogether. And I know that's lofty. But I think incrementally we're getting there. We're taking the fence down maybe one splinter at a time, but we are getting there.
Yeah. And I think, again, speaking to our male listeners out there, it requires you also to step up to the plate and be there to say, you know what? This isn't fair that she gets paid $0.75. It isn't fair that there isn't more diversity on our board of directors. This isn't fair. Why do school times end at 3:30 in the afternoon? How can any family pick up their kids and also have a full-time job? This doesn't work anymore. The old systems and the old ways of functioning maybe worked in the 50s and 60s when that lifestyle and that family dynamic in the household was like that. But let's change it. And I think it requires us as a collective, male, female, gay, straight, black, blue, purple, or green, to actually come together and just start saying, well, actually, yeah, that is old. And let's find a better way to do this, right?
It's old, and it's not including everybody's voices. This Make America Great Again is looking back on this kind of 1950s, 1960s, like ideal whatever, which never actually existed. Right. Because it was just lifting up the voices of white men in the workforce. And there were so many people and so many voices that weren't heard, who weren't privileged in those decades. So wouldn't it be great if we could make America great for the first time? And we do that by dismantling some of those.
Yeah. So you, in your work, you are the host of a podcast, Wild Cozy Truth, which again, the links are down below. You also run the Feminist Book Club, which sounds really fun. But you also call yourself a feminist life coach. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's recognizing all of these intersectionalities, all of these things and structures and institutions in our society that hold us back, and working within your, I don't want to say your place in society, because I think your place is mobile and fluid and can change, but working where you are to create positive change in your own life. Yeah. So whatever that means for you, whatever success means for you, a feminist life coach will recognize the barriers to that and help you dismantle them and figure out ways where you can make progress.
So make sure to click the links in our show notes to be able to check out more about Renee and her work. So Renee, I want to ask you a couple of questions that we like to ask all of our guests. First and foremost, is there a book out there or maybe a blog that you're reading right now that's really inspiring you or maybe poking a few holes in your belief system right now?
Yeah. So one of the most recent books with the Feminist Book Club, all of our members vote on the book of the month. So I actually have no say over what goes in each book club month box.
Oh, interesting.
So they suggested and voted on a book called This Will Be My Undoing by Morgan Jerkins. And she is a young Black woman living in Harlem who grew up in a very white suburb. And it's a memoir of her, or a series of essays of her, like grappling with what it means to be Black. And it was really uncomfortable to read, and challenged a lot of my own conceptions of race. And I really, really appreciated the way that she presented her stories. And she's a comparative lit major, and you can totally see it. Like, she brings in a lot of history to her own experiences. And it was a really kind of gut-wrenching, wonderful read. So I would strongly recommend that.
Great. Is there maybe one person in your circle or network that you think we should interview on the Simplifiers podcast, and why?
Yeah. Can I say two?
Sure, you can recommend two.
One of the authors of one of the books that we read, her name is Laleen Sukera. She is the author of the book Austenistan, which is a retelling of Jane Austen novels in modern Pakistan. And she lives in Lahore, Pakistan herself. And she actually joined us for our book club. She's the editor of this book. It was an anthology. She's incredible. She would be a fantastic guest. But I also want to shout out my friend Sharon Podobnik-Peterson. She is kind of my business bestie. She also has a subscription box service called the Go Love Yourself box, which is very similar to the Feminist Book Club box. Every month she sends out a self-help book and self-care products along that correlate with those titles. So she's an executive leadership coach in the education sphere. She would be a great guest for you all.
That's great. Fantastic. Well, we will reach out to both of them and hopefully get them on the podcast really, really soon. So Renee, gratitude and simplicity in my mind, like they go hand in hand. What is one thing you're grateful for right now in your life?
I'm grateful for, is it weird to say Minneapolis? I'm grateful that I've lived here a year, and I'm so glad that I'm here. It's exactly where I needed to be.
Yeah, I actually got to visit Minneapolis at the beginning of 2018, and I was quite surprised. Like, it's a cool, funky little city. I had no idea. I definitely want to come back and see it again.
I would love to show you around.
Yeah, it's so cool. So what do you think is maybe one superpower that you possess that really helps you in your work or in your life?
I love this question. So I'm a strong believer that everybody has a superpower, but they're often so ordinary that we don't realize that they're a superpower. So my totally ordinary superpower is I always know the exact perfect Tupperware container for leftovers. Like I can look at a pot of like leftover spaghetti or whatever and know exactly which container to put it in, which is just like that much room at the top. So
I love it.
yeah, that is my superpower.
I love it. And can I just ask you, this is more on the simplicity side. When you stack your Tupperware in your kitchen cabinet, do you stack it with the lid already attached to it, or do you stack all the containers and then all the lids?
The lids, so God bless IKEA, right? They've got these pot lid dividers that I use for they're like expandable, kind of like magazine dividers that I stack all my lids in. So
these are the incredibly important questions in life. But, sometimes it is true. Like we deal with taking down the patriarchy, but we also have to deal with, organizing our Tupperware lids. So thank you for that tip as well. So Renee, I just really want to acknowledge you at this moment. Like these conversations are not easy, as you can tell, but they are so vitally important. And I hope that people that have listened today are intrigued about what you do and how you show up out in the world, and will check out your podcast, Wild Cozy Truth. Check out your feminist book club, because I think that's so cool. And because again, it comes down to starting conversations. So I really want to applaud you for being bold and just being brave, like showing up and you don't have all the answers. None of us do, but just starting the conversation is really important. So just a reminder to everybody, again, click in the show notes to find her details. You hang out where the most on social media? Where can we find you?
Personally, you could find me on Instagram at Wild Cozy Truth, but I would encourage you to come check out Feminist Book Club Box on Instagram as well. It's at Feminist Book Club Box. And I'm not sure if I shared that with you, but I created a coupon code for your listeners.
Yep.
So if you're interested in getting a little discount on your first Feminist Book Club box, you can use the code SIMPLIFY at feministbookclub.com.
Amazing. So $5 off your first box. Just use the code SIMPLIFY. And again, you can check out feministbookclub.com for all the details on the next box. So my last little question for you is this, Renee. Somebody's listened to this episode and they're intrigued. Maybe they are a business owner and, just really like saying, you know what, actually enough is enough. It's time to do something different. She's inspired, but she's also sitting there going, oh, I'm just one person. What can I really do? What's one thing that you could encourage her and whisper into her ear right now that could make a difference?
It doesn't take big, sweeping changes to make a difference. One small thing, one change of your own language is still progress.
Renee, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.